17th. It is the December meeting of the San Francisco SRO Task Force. I am the chair, Rosemary Bosky. It is approximately 9:02 a.m. Thursday morning, and I'm giving a call to order. We do have a quorum. So with that, we will go then to review of the November minutes. So if the task force membership could take a look at that, that will be great. I know that I think it got sent out a day or so ago. These are action minutes because, as you all are aware, this is a meeting that is being audio taped for the convenience of the public, because this will be put on our website. So does anyone have any items on the minutes that they wish to correct or amend? Jordan. And if you could identify yourself. Thank you so much.
Jordan Davis for the record. We should mention that Minush Kendall from the Department on the Status of Women came here and gave a presentation. So that would be my only
Thank you. Thank you for that. That was not included, and that was an error. So we'll go ahead and mention that. And that will also mention that if there was any materials that is on the website. So we'll go ahead and do that. Very good. Thank you. That's a big omission. Any other comments on the minutes? Okay. Is there a motion to approve the minutes with that amendment?
I motion.
Motion by Dan, a second by another member. So we have that. So it was a second by Wolfgang. So with that, on the approval of the November 2017 minutes, is there any public comment on that item? There being none, then all those in favor of adopting the minutes with that amendment, can I have a show of hands in the affirmative? Thank you. Any individual that is against that? So the minutes with that amendment have been approved by the membership. So then going on to the next item, we do have a presentation today, and I want to go ahead and get to this particular item. It's the Department of Homelessness and Supportive Services, so we are happy for that representation. If I could have you introduce yourself, and then I'm going to go ahead and give you the floor.
Great. Hi, my name is Carrie Abbott. I'm with the Department of Homelessness and Supportive Housing, and I'm the Deputy Director for Programs. And should I go ahead and jump in?
Absolutely.
Would it be okay to have people introduce themselves?
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you.
So if we could go around the room.
Okay, Dan Jordan.
And if you can indicate what seat you are, so that if she's looking at the agenda.
Tenant representative.
Thank you, Dan.
Hi, I'm Diana Martinez. I'm the Program Manager of Mission SRO Collaborative.
Sam Patel, SRO.
Good morning, Bruce Burridge, Operator, SROs.
Larry Kessler, Department of Public Health. Peter Keith with the City Attorney's Office. I'm a non-voting legal advisor.
Clifford Gilmore, Associate CDSO Collaborative.
Welcome to Homelessness Supportive Housing.
Jordan Davis, Tenant Representative.
And if you two could introduce yourselves.
Angelique Gold, Permit Technician at Housing Inspection.
Okay, Jennifer Chanju, I'm the Administrative Support.
Thank you. And Rosemary Bosky, Chair. So I'm going to move over to give you the floor.
Actually, then I
Thank
can
you.
see everybody's faces if they are glaring at me or anything. All right, I'll stand up. So this is fun. We're just downstairs, much of our department, where the Housing and Homeless Division of HSA used to be. Much of the Department of Homelessness and Supportive Housing is here at 1650 Mission. We have a whole bunch of people at 1360 Mission, our admin finance folks, and Homeward Bound. And then Wolfgang's team, our adult housing programs, is still all over at 101 Grove. So we're still spread out around the city. We're just about a year and a half old as a department, and we've been working hard to kind of get on our feet, and we spent much of the first year trying to develop a framework. The framework is not a huge full force implementation plan for everything that we want to do around homelessness and supportive housing in San Francisco. It's a framework for how we want to approach it and what some of our big goals are going to be over the next 5 years to try and make a difference, to try to sort of bend the curve on homelessness. As you all, I'm sure, are aware, there's been a ton of work done by people that you all represent, landlords, city departments, tenants alike, have contributed to trying to get people off the street and into safe places to live. And we're still in very much the same place we were, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, in terms of numbers of homeless. So we've done a lot of data modeling to try to get to what it would actually take to bend the curve down instead of keeping it flat. So our strategic framework. This is a basic presentation. It doesn't cover every aspect, but it gives you a pretty good idea of what we're working for. So the development, again, was over last year. We worked with stakeholders, service providers, housing providers, nonprofit community, staff, clients. We conducted over 1,000 interviews with homeless people to try and inform what we were doing. The summary, kind of the overarching point of the framework is to try to reach a significant sustained reduction in homelessness, and to do this by preventing it where possible, and whenever homelessness occurs, to try to get people back off the street and into housing as quickly as possible. The system, if we succeed, will better meet the needs of people experiencing homelessness, but also improve the operations of our nonprofit service providers and enable the city to better manage the housing portfolio. We want to emphasize, though, that this plan does not get us to ending homelessness. This is not another, 10-year plan or 5-year plan, and we're going to have no more homeless people at the end of this. We believe that if we do everything in this plan, we can get to reducing chronic homelessness by 50% in 5 years, which is already a really big deal. Ending homelessness will take us longer. So the big goals in the framework are up here. We have 2 big systems change goals. One is to design and implement coordinated systems for all of our different populations, and we divide those into adults, families with children, and youth, and that's all to be done in the next 12 months. And our second big system goal is to implement performance accountability across all of our programs by December 2019. There we're talking about if we are contracting with service providers, if we are renting housing, if we are doing outreach, then what do we expect from our system for what we're paying into it? And then the specific goals by population, we have the adults, again, reducing chronic homelessness by 50% by December 2022. Families, we are working to end unsheltered family homelessness by the end of 2018 and to end family homelessness by December 2021. What we mean by that is not, like, we can't prevent all instances of homelessness. We know people will get evicted. We know people will lose jobs and people will end up in dire circumstances. What we're saying is that if a family with children becomes homeless in January of 2022, we will be able to house them within our system within 90 days. So that's what we're looking to get to. For youth, right now we're working on completing our detailed plan for ending youth homelessness. San Francisco is one of 10 cities that got chosen by HUD as a demonstration city to bring innovative solutions to working with transition age youth. And we're talking about some 16 to 18-year-olds and then a huge number of 18 to 24-year-olds. Street homelessness, what we're looking to do is improve the city's response to street homelessness. And what this means is creating kind of an interdepartmental operation where we're working with the police department, with public works, and with public health, and our hot team, and whenever there's a problem in the city, we all know who responds and how. And if people call 311, then they know, kind of 311 knows what to do with the complaints and concerns. And then ending large long-term encampments by July 2019. Large long-term encampments, we're talking about places where we have 6 or 8 or 10 or 12 tents, and they're there for multiple months. Causes of homelessness. This is the SRO collaborative. You guys are familiar with the housing affordability crisis in California and in San Francisco. We know that we have lost overall federal support for housing subsidies over the last 20 years. California's Prop 13 makes it difficult to bring the right revenue in to end homelessness. And then there are obviously differing opinions on this, but rent control, the state laws can limit the ability to enact rent control in a way that can protect vulnerable tenants. I think we've talked a lot about the Reagan years. I think we are still in a situation in San Francisco where we have a lot of people who don't have adequate support in housing to be able to maintain housing. And some of those people come in and out, especially in private residences where they don't have more intensive support. We still don't have the right number of kind of board and care or skilled nursing facilities in San Francisco to be able to accommodate the people with serious mental illnesses. So those are just some of the factors that come into the population that we're working with. Homelessness in San Francisco, this is what we talked about a minute ago. This is just the last 4 years. But you can really see like our total number of homeless population has not changed significantly at all. We had a slight increase in the number of chronically homeless adults, and we had some decreases in homeless families and homeless youth over the last few years. Our budget to address homelessness, people focus a lot on what we're doing with the encampments and street homelessness, but you can see from how we're structured, 66% of our budget goes to supportive housing. And that includes all of the master lease sites. That includes the DAW sites, the MOCD sites where we have subsidies and services. We spend 18% on temporary shelter. That includes all the shelters and navigation centers. We spend 7% on street outreach, 7% on administration, and 2% on health services. And this is where we work order money to Department of Public Health specifically for services within our supportive housing.
Could you talk just a little about how some of these functions were in other departments? So some of these
Sure.
were in HSA, some were in DPH, and were ultimately then migrated over to the Department of Homelessness?
Sure.
Just a little.
Yeah. So it's a little bit, it doesn't exactly correspond with the budget. So within HSA, we had the shelter system and the navigation centers. And then we also had the master lease portfolio of like Care Not Cash and the kind of the leased housing for very low income folks. And then within public health, we have the hot team, which is we have about 7 city staff and then about 60 contracted staff to do outreach in the streets. And we had direct access to housing. And that includes the Mental Health Services Act housing and the MOCD run housing. Mostly those are nonprofit owned buildings. And then a few leased sites in DAW.
And that's now all migrated?
That's all under HSH now. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Sure. So what we use that money for, sorry.
That's okay. I just had 2 questions.
Yeah.
Hopefully real quickly. The bar chart you showed with the number of homeless, is that doubled up or is there like 15,000 homeless people in San Francisco?
Oh, good question. That's people who are on the streets or in shelter. That does not include doubled up.
So the adults doesn't include the chronically homeless?
Oh yeah. No. Oh, so it does. So all adults would include chronically homeless adults. I
What
thought
do
you
you
meant,
mean by
does it
doubled
include people who are doubled up in housing, like they don't have their own
Well,
place?
you have a bar that says there's 7,000 adults
Right.
homeless, and then you have another bar that
Right.
says there's 6,400 chronically homeless.
Right, so.
But those are the same numbers.
Yes.
Great.
So the chronically homeless are within the adult
Okay.
population.
And then the second thing, the percentages are interesting, but what's the dollar on the budget?
So it's about $239 million. And that does not include, the graph doesn't include any capital expenditures. So capital expenditures are in the 239, but they are not on the pie chart. Let's see, and it also doesn't include the philanthropic support that we get, because that support has been deployed either directly to the nonprofits or through foundation funds. It doesn't typically go into our department.
So in other words, the information that the city has historically is that you've had maybe a little less than 7,500 people on this homeless from year to year.
Yes.
And that particular number appears to be like that's static or consistent.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that's right. The budget increased 12% in the last fiscal year, and over 10 million of the increases were from state and federal funds. We brought in a lot of new funding through whole person care, and we'll be bringing in new funding through No Place Like Home to build additional capital units. Hi. So this is what we're spending the money on. Right now, on an annual basis, we have 1,500 eviction prevention slots, 800 homeward bound slots. That's where if someone has come from another place or they have family in another place and they want to go back, we will pay to have them go back if they have a verified place to go. Under outreach, we have about 200 chairs in resource centers. We have our HOT team, and we also have the encampment response team, which is connected with HOT, but brings sort of specific tactics and strategies to try to work with people who are camped out long term. Jordan?
I have a question. Like you said, 200 chairs. What do you mean by chairs?
I mean, like chairs.
Oh yeah, so like I was thinking about like the chairs in like the women's shelter here, and like in various shelters where people are like propped up. So
Yeah, they're not cots, and resource centers have different levels of chairs. You know, some kind of recline, some don't, and it's really just like this is how many people they can accommodate at one time. And so some people, it might be during the day coming in for case management or referrals, and some people might be hanging out for a couple hours in the middle of the night. Temporary shelter, we had last month, we had 2,367 beds. We're working on another 1,000, as most of you have probably heard. It's expanding quickly. We're looking at a lot of different properties, a lot of different projects to try to get people out of the cold right now. Housing, we have 7,403 units of housing that we subsidize and provide services to. And then we have 961 short-term subsidies where these are like rapid rehousing, where we can place a family and give them a subsidy for a couple of years until they're able to take over their own rent. The housing ladder, so this framework is already outdated. We started out with 50 moving on initiative subsidies. We actually have in the pipeline 350 moving on initiative subsidies with the San Francisco Housing Authority, so that people in permanent supportive housing can, if they have paid their rent and are in compliance with their lease, they can get a housing choice voucher and work with our nonprofit Brilliant Corners, or families can work with Hamilton Families to try to find their own apartment building, their own apartment unit. We will subsidize the rent to make up the difference between what they can afford and what the fair market rent is, and we can provide some level of housing stabilization services when people move in. But we're targeting people who've been in supportive housing for, some of them, 15 years, who no longer need the intensive services. Yes.
Have you been able to track how effective the Move On program has been working?
So it's pretty new. We just started it this year, and we were not moving people in until spring. We have had now a bunch of move-ins into private units, the majority of them in San Francisco. We just started moving families in the fall out to, and you know, families are more likely to find units that they can settle in other counties because San Francisco doesn't have very many larger units that are available in the rental market. And we've had also some people move into the RAD portfolio in the Housing Authority. So the buildings that Housing Authority converted over to nonprofit management about a year and a half ago. People are now, they get a formerly homeless priority on the Housing Authority wait list. So they can go and have the ongoing financial support if they can afford to move out into the community without a subsidy, but without the intensive services.
And we've had people who actually have gone through the process and have had to get an extension because they would not have been able to actually find a place that would accept a voucher.
Yeah, and
so we find that's an issue.
It's happened a lot. Well, especially in the beginning because the nonprofit that we contracted with was not really ready to go, and so they were new to the San Francisco market. They'd done great work in Los Angeles, or largely new to San Francisco, and it took a while to get the kind of, you know, group of landlords willing to work with them. Back here, and then, sorry.
Just for clarification, is that master lease?
That's a combination of owned and leased.
So the SRO type units would fall typically in that category?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah, that was closer to my question, which is what types of housing are included in those 7,400?
Yeah, so the portfolio is going to be a mix. So there are a bunch of city leased buildings, and that was mostly done through Department of Public Health under DAW. And then there are a bunch of nonprofit leased buildings. Those were largely done through HSA, and that's like the Tenderloin Housing Clinic type leased units. And then there are a lot of units that were built with loans from MoCD, so the Mayor's Office of Housing and Community Development finances or brings in tax credit financing with the nonprofit to build, site-built units for supportive housing. And those are a combination of 100% supportive housing, and then most of the family units in that portfolio are actually, we have 20% of the building would be formerly homeless families, and the rest would be affordable housing for families.
Now, how does the Housing Authority units fit into that 7,403 number?
Those, so we have some Housing Authority subsidies within those. We are not counting, so if someone is homeless and they get into a Housing Authority unit, we don't count that. That's not in our portfolio.
And are people, since the Housing Authority rents are already controlled, are people does DISH provide subsidies for any of those?
No.
Units?
So that's a very, firm no. I would say, we're providing some housing stabilization services in some of the RAD portfolio where people who are formerly homeless are moving in and need more support than is available at a Housing Authority site.
There's a number, there's a number of sites where it's really mixed housing.
Yeah.
And some of them which are totally supported by the Housing Authority, but they still offer up 10-20% of the building to the homelessness and supportive housing sites. The most recent development of Housing Authority vouchers into some of the local operating subsidy buildings lowers rents for everybody in the building. So what it means is initially the idea was 600 public housing vouchers going into the existing local operating subsidy housing, and thereby lowering the rent of everybody who participates in the program, even though they may not be in a housing authority store. It lowers the rents to 30%.
And that's a distinction. What I'm saying is the Housing Authority properties we don't count as homeless units, but the Housing Authority administers many of the subsidies that we do use in homeless units. Is that making sense?
How many shelter beds are needed to fully address the homeless
Can I remind everybody to identify themselves since this is being audio recorded? Thank you.
This is G-Dog Buckta speaking. How many shelter beds are needed to fully address crisis, and are you working on getting us towards there?
We are. So,
Could you repeat the question?
yeah, so the question was how many shelter beds would be needed. And obviously, what I'm going to tell you back first is what we really need is additional housing units. And we do need shelter beds in the interim, but what our focus is to get enough housing on for all of the people who are homeless. Because if we only build shelter beds, then we still have the same number of homeless people. That said, we can absolutely save lives by getting people off the street and connected to services and have a warm place. And what our projected gap was around 1,000 additional shelter beds would mean that people would not have to be street homeless long term. We have to test that. There's a lot of fluidity in the shelter population. People come and go. Our one night count of homeless people is 7,000, but over the course of the year that might be 18,000. So we have to test it. We've never been in the situation yet where we had enough shelter beds to accommodate the requests for shelter.
For the uninitiated, could you make a distinction, because obviously the Department of Homelessness and Supportive Housing its function is, say, maybe a little different than the Housing Authority on transitional housing versus permanent housing, and those may be terms that are changing as we speak. But obviously your portfolio isn't necessarily focusing completely on, say, permanent housing, because your goal is dealing with homelessness. So if you could just make that distinction for the uninitiated, I think that would be helpful for our guests, the public, and our members.
Sure. So I want to start out here with the temporary shelter. So that's right now we have the 2,367 shelter beds. That's a combination of shelters that you can drop in one night, or you can get a 90-day reservation for adult shelters. We also have family shelters where people can stay up to 6 months, and they're single unit shelters. We have very little transitional housing. There, in our department, there are only a couple transitional housing sites, one for veterans and 2 for families. It's just something that we do not have a large portfolio of. We've tried to get people, once they move into a housing unit, then they have tenants' rights within that housing unit.
So what would the categories be? Would it be supportive housing, transitional housing, permanent housing? Is that how it works? For some of us that don't know, that would be kind of good to just maybe describe the basic categories.
Right. Yeah. So other than those few transitional housing units, our portfolio is supportive housing, and that is all permanent housing. So everyone has a lease, everyone has tenants' rights, and that's the 7,403 units. The transitional housing goes in the temporary side when we do our inventory, because it's time limited. And so then permanent housing, what I would say is permanent housing is, that's where I live. That's also where our tenants live. Another word for supportive housing is permanent supportive housing. And we're trying to give people the option to move out to places where they don't need the support part of it, if they no longer need the support part of it. And so then they could just be in permanent housing with a subsidy. And that would be our housing ladder.
And the navigation centers fit into this how?
They're in the temporary shelter. So even though people can often stay longer, and we try to identify people who are going to get prioritized for housing based on eligibility, vulnerability, length of homelessness, and work with them until they can move into the next housing unit that's available, it's still temporary. It's still a shared space.
And you have how many navigation centers so far?
So right now we have 4. 2 of those are temporary because they're going to be building housing on those sites. And we have, as of today, I think we have an additional 4 in the pipeline. So we are planning to open new navigation centers in March, April, May.
And is one of them has to do with an SRO, correctly? Isn't the Civic Center Hotel?
The
part of
Civic
that?
Center Hotel, because it's slated to go under construction, is being used as a navigation center since people can't come in and get, newly get tenants' rights. So that is a temporary, so it is an SRO building. We are using it as a navigation center, but that is 100% people who have a path to housing. So again, like people we've identified as, these are folks who are going to get prioritized for the permanent housing that we have in our pipeline. These are great questions.
And I do have another question about like subsidies. Like people in master lease buildings are paying flat rate rents, and like given our given that we're not under the rent ordinance, like what's preventing them from jacking up the rents? Jacking up the rents like in a manner like that, and what are you doing to make sure that it's like this housing is like income based?
So there are a couple questions there, I think. One related to what do we do to keep the rent stable is that we enter typically into long-term leases with landlords, and so then the rents get set by the agency that's leasing the building as opposed to the owner of the building. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. So you're like, are you like still subsidizing, say, THC, like?
Right. Yeah, and there are a bunch of different subsidy structures. Part of that, a relic of having brought together different departments. There's the way that Mo did it, the way that DPH did it, and the way that HSA did it. And we are actually trying to look at ways to try to standardize that and have it be more income based. But it's a huge project. It's a huge project to try to manage financially and logistically. So San Francisco started out with already having developed a lot of amazing kind of model programs. And I feel really lucky that we have this as our starting point for the department, and then we get to build and expand on it. Direct access to housing, which is the idea was, people shouldn't have to go through transitional programs. They shouldn't have to go through multiple hoops to qualify. And we should be able to bring in the services they need to the housing site. San Francisco Homeless Outreach Team, getting really responsive, trained social workers out on the street to be able to connect people to services, started how long ago, like 15, 20 years ago. The Encampment Resolution Team is using social work strategies to try to engage with people who have refused shelter in the past. Heading Home is bringing in philanthropy to subsidize the rapid rehousing subsidies for families, and especially families with kids in the San Francisco Unified School District, to try to keep from having families get displaced. Navigation centers, we're just talking about where we bring a shelter model but give a little more space. We allow people to bring in pets, partners, and property. And we try to make a more flexible length of stay, a more flexible lower barrier entry to the service. Homeward Bound, we'll try and connect people with their friends and family in other places if they have a place to go. Project Homeless Connect, trying to bring people in from the street, connect them to services, and really kind of galvanizing volunteers in the community who want to do something to assist. And then Jazzy's Place was the country's first LGBTQ shelter.
Now, in terms of the Heading Home program and the kind of the role of private philanthropy, how much money per year are we talking about? What are the major sources, and is it a year after year commitment?
Yeah, I think that so the initial donation was $25 million from Benioff. Yeah, I mean, I know that, and the goal was through other fundraising that we, being the city and its nonprofit partners, were able to match that $25 million. And it's their ongoing fundraising efforts. I don't know if you guys remember, like every home run, I think, gave new money to Hamilton families last year for this initiative, actually. So on the other hand, what we didn't have was a model system for organizing those resources. And I have traced these arrows. Like, you might think that this is just a like dropped-in slide, like just show a mess, and it's not. Like, this is literally the path that people would have to go through to try to get to supportive housing, or to try to get housed on their own, or to try to get to rapid rehousing. Not ideal for someone who may be sick, who may be very disorganized, who may have been homeless for many years. It could be really overwhelming. I actually started out working at the General Assistance Advocacy Project a long time ago, and I learned really quickly that it was like a full-time job for people to just stay on general assistance, and that wasn't enough for rent. So, like, the way the system was set up was not really engaging people in a path to housing. This is what we're building. We're partway there. This is our coordinated entry, our homeless response system that we are trying to get to, where wherever you start, we find a way to connect you through our coordinated entry system. So we have our hot workers doing coordinated entry out on the street. We'll have all of our shelters and resource centers doing coordinated entry, our nonprofit partners doing coordinated entry. Right now we've launched our family site, and we're about to bring in partners for the single adult sites. The coordinated entry functions are to assess, to provide problem solving, to try to figure out a way to keep someone from having to enter the homeless response system, which is an expensive system and can take a long time for someone to actually get where they want to go. The prioritization, so based on vulnerability and length of homelessness, we prioritize the highest level of resource, and for others we try to match to the appropriate resource. And then we refer, and we can refer to temporary shelter, rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing, and then eventually from there you get the housing ladder and or housed on your own. You had a question?
Yes, Raul Fernandez of Rosales with the SRO Families United Collaborative. There are two separate questions. The first one is regarding the previous slide. I was wondering, before the implementation of the your department, the wait list for families to access the shelter was about 6 to 8 months, and I was wondering, what is it now?
So there's no waiting list to access family shelter now. The referrals into family shelter, into the single unit shelters, are based on prioritization. So based on someone's immediate safety, where they're sleeping right now, and chronically homeless folks can have a priority. We're not keeping a like point in time wait list. So it's just a different system.
A separate question. So I am familiar with the coordinated entry system, and I find it somewhat problematic for families that live in SROs because they are labeled as low priority, right? And I don't need to be overly critical, but like low priority sounds to me like a euphemism for your own.
Yeah, they are not low priority at all. Families who have a place to sleep are not prioritized for shelter. Our prioritization for permanent supportive housing is for the highest needs people if they are homeless under the San Francisco definition of homelessness, period. It's not based on unsheltered or doubled up or tripled up or in an unsafe place. It's based on who's most likely to need that long-term intervention. So, and then the other thing, I know you know, Raul, but there's also a lot of work that's been done to try to get access by the SRO collaboratives to housing authority vouchers for people who are in units where they're over occupancy. So core components of the homelessness response system, and we've gone through a bunch of these already. I won't go too much in depth, but coordinated entry, street outreach, problem solving, and this is where we try and figure out like any other thing than going into shelter and trying to wait forever for permanent housing, temporary shelter, getting into housing, and the housing ladder. Our data model. So how do we figure out how many beds we need? How do we figure out how many housing units we need? We take our homeless count We add in people who come in on a monthly and annual basis. We subtract out the number of people we place into a housing unit. We add in returns, so people who don't make it in housing after we place them. And then we subtract out the people who disappear from our system, and we don't know what happened to them. That's how we get to next year's homeless count. So then, in order to decrease the homeless count, we take our inputs, we add to Homeward Bound, we add to rapid rehousing, we add to housing, and we try to get to the number of units we need. So in order to bring down the chronically homeless population by the 50% that we want to get to by 2022, this is what, so the green are the new people coming in, and then the gray is what we have to do to bend the curve. So we have to place every year that number of people in order to get down to half of the chronically homeless. And I know that, so chronically homeless, yeah.
Peter Keith, why is there a prediction for 22 and 23 that there will be fewer people coming into the system?
Because that's when the number of new housing units in the pipeline is increasing the most.
Homeless housing units?
Yeah, homeless housing units. So when the department started, there were no new supportive housing units for single adults in the built pipeline in the city. There were some leased units in the pipeline, some ideas for how we can increase the portfolio. There were no new buildings being built that were set aside for homeless people. We now have about 1,200 units identified, set aside for homeless people in the built pipeline, but it takes 5 years to build them. So, yes.
Yeah, Bruce Burge, 2017, so if I had to understand that there are point in time 2,155 chronically homeless people in San Francisco at this point? It doesn't seem like very many.
No. Sorry. So, yeah, so that's the chronically homeless adult population.
2,155 people.
Uh-huh.
I thought it was closer to 7,500.
No, that's the homeless population.
Okay, can you explain the difference?
Yeah, sure. So, let's see. I can go back. So, this is the total population, the 73, that's 2013, so I'll come over here. So the total population, the 7499, right? And then 6881 of those are adults.
But those are the same numbers, or part of the same numbers.
Right, 6,800 of the 7,500 are adults, right?
Okay.
And then of the adults, 2,155 are chronically homeless. So those are people who've been homeless longer than a year or multiple instances and have a disability. So a lot of our homeless adults have not been homeless that long and or are not disabled.
Okay, so this is just a specialized subset of the adults that are homeless.
Yes, and they're the hardest to house and typically stay on the streets the longest. And so that's why we're trying to focus first on that. And then the 1363 are the transition age youth. Again, part of the adult population, not necessarily part of the chronic population. And the 190 is families with minor children.
So the grand total, according to the chart, is 7,500 people homeless in San Francisco.
Correct.
For 2017.
On one night.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Let's see if I can get back.
When can we expect that bonus, that chart to go down to zero?
Oh.
It depends. I mean, really, it depends on the investment. And it depends on the sustained investment. I mean, what we know is if we can outpace the newly chronic people and the returns to homelessness with our housing placements and our prevention, that's how we get there. And so it takes 5 years of bringing on 1,200 units and 1,000 rapid rehousing subsidies and 800 homeward bound placements a year to get it down by half. So with that sustained investment, theoretically, we would get there in another 5 years or less. Our consultants think we can do it in less. Yes.
Peter, Keith, is there a goal with regard to that non-chronically homeless population? I mean, there are about 5,000 now. Is there some kind of a set goal that the DHSH has in terms of what that number should be?
Not yet. And I mean, just being completely transparent, like we had 15 different data systems and we don't know enough about the rest of the population yet to figure out what all of the appropriate interventions are going to be to get to zero on the full adult population.
And also because those characteristics are different, there are other opportunities that they may avail themselves of from HSA and other and the housing authority. And as you said, it's not completely profiled yet, but I think that's part of what they're looking at, and that's why their criteria is focusing on the most vulnerable of that population.
Right, and so these are the key strategies. Yes.
Oh, quick, Gilmore. Quick question on that subset of chronically homeless. Is there a strategy or to sort of pinpoint those who are chronically homeless as adults who go through the system and get recycled back out again and come back in again and go back out again?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's actually, I don't know if you guys follow, but there's been this big initiative, Whole Person Care, that's statewide, and we're working really closely with public health. We're looking at people who are hitting the shelters and navigation centers, are not getting into housing, are using high-cost healthcare interventions, are working with behavioral health, still don't have Medi-Cal, and still don't have a path to housing. Like, those are folks that we're actually meeting now weekly with public health to say, like, what are we doing, like really actually going line by line, case by case, as we've done with veterans, to say, what are we doing with each of these people? It's pretty exciting. So the key strategies, implementing coordinated entry. This is a huge lift. I mean, it sounds like, oh, well, we'll just prioritize. But first you have to merge the 15 different data systems, which is taking us a year. It's really complex, and obviously, like, all these different systems have had different data fields and different levels of data quality and different levels of users. So that's been pretty massive. We have tested the prioritization tools and are having the testing results evaluated to make sure that we're prioritizing in ways that are fair and equitable. We are offering, our goal is to offer problem-solving options to everyone who comes into our system. Right now, Homeward Bound does outreach, and we have some prevention programs, and like our family access points are now doing problem-solving. We want to offer problem-solving to anyone seeking homeless services.
Yeah. Carrie, just back to the number. Yeah. the intervention that happens in the system happens to everybody. The ones that get prioritized for housing are the chronically homeless. So we're trying to prevent the chronic homeless.
Right.
The 7 out of the 7,000 people, a lot of people will take some of the problem-solving ideas and prevent chronic homelessness. Either return home, find something else, and what have you. So they are not part of the 2,500.
Yeah, okay, I think I get it. I'm just trying to get the big picture on.
Because referrals, as she said, were one of the big components of that.
Right. So then targeting housing resources, again, like the most intensive long-term resources to those with the highest level of need, providing population-specific programs and services. So we're trying to get really responsive, youth-specific coordinated entry to try and engage the young people who haven't been coming into services, and developing a plan to address the gaps in the system as we identify them. We know basically, like, there's not enough housing. We don't know specifically how much of that housing needs to be for families in which one of the parents has a serious mental illness. And that's what we're trying to get to with the data system and the assessment and prioritization. So don't think we're not doing anything while we make the plan. This is what we've been doing in the last 12 months. We maintained 9,000 people in supportive housing. We assisted 1,900 people with exits from homelessness. We provided temporary shelter to 7,000 unique individuals. We engage 6,000 people on the street with outreach and services. And we provided 450 people in the 18 largest encampments in the city with shelter and services. We had about, of people in encampments, we had about 2/3 of those folks move into the navigation centers and the other third move on. So it's an ongoing piece of work, but when people are engaged and given another option, we find that they often take it.
Carrie, and based on what you've said, the case management is irrelevant as you can profile and get more of an understanding of what the unique needs are for this population.
Right, exactly. And where it used to just be kind of a check-in, hey, how's it going? Do you need any services? We're trying to get to, hi, are you already in our coordinated entry system? Have you checked in with your case manager? Are you still trying to get into this nav center because they have a bed tonight? To really have the on-site live information available for people.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
I'm Diana Martinez, for the record. I see that you have maintained 9,000 formerly homeless adults, families and youth in permanent supportive housing. Are there a lot of efforts in order to maintain formerly homeless people in private housing from your department specifically?
Yeah, so the theory would be if we can place someone in a privately owned unit without a subsidy, then could we also provide services? Is that the question?
Or do you provide services?
So I can't think of a single place where we can place someone right now without a subsidy.
Okay.
But the rapid rehousing programs, they have a subsidy. It's a private, they have their own lease with the landlord, and we do provide ongoing services.
Okay, so
does that...
Am I understanding this correctly? When you say maintain them in the supportive housing, does that mean just specifically with rent subsidies, or is that also with
case
they
management.
have some sort? Okay, case. Okay.
And
Right.
often kind of like, some additional housing stabilization services. We, in many cases, get people furniture. Some of these places we provide meals. So there's it's a huge variety of supportive housing.
All right. The reason I ask is because there are some SRO tenants that come to our case manager who live in private units, or sometimes landlords come to us and say, oh, this person is having an issue with hoarding or this or that, and I'm going to have to evict them. And I was just wondering if you had something specific for people in private housing to deal with those kinds of issues. Not so much rent-based, but
Right. No, that's a good question. So when we encounter a case like that, we typically try to bring in the appropriate resource. It's not necessarily in our department. So we would reach out to the Department of Adult and Aging Services. They have a community living fund where they can provide case management to adults who are disabled, and they work a lot on hoarding and cluttering. They also control adult protective services if someone's gravely disabled. And then, there are situations where we will bring in DBI or environmental health to try to get additional resources for people who are living in private units. And we try to recognize that this is not our lane. Like, this is, what we're set up to do is the homelessness part and the supportive housing part. We want to support people in preventing new incidents of homelessness, though. So we will try to connect them wherever we can. Yeah.
Peter Keith. So a lot of the complaints that as government employees we receive from members of the public is homelessness is worse than it's ever been. And
right.
So I'm curious, from the standpoint of the experts dealing with it, is the issue that the numbers of homelessness are greater than say 10 years ago? Is it the problem people are facing are different, or is it that it's just more visible?
Yeah. So I think there are a couple things that I see. One, so first of all, the numbers are the same. I mean, they inch up, but they're the same. And we've seen like Los Angeles, San Diego County, other counties in the Northwest, all over the West Coast have gone up 25%, 30% of their homeless population. Alameda County has gone up like 28%. There's a huge problem on the West Coast. And in San Francisco, it's been really flat. I was a little surprised because you're right, like visibly, it seems like there are more homeless people. So a couple things. One is the amount of building in San Francisco has forced people out of places where they used to camp onto sidewalks where they're far more visible. Two is some friends in the provider and advocate community started handing out tents. And tents are a lot more visible and tend to stay places longer than someone in a sleeping bag. It's just, and it looks like a bigger encampment when you have 5 tents than when you just have 5 people. And then the third thing is that I think a lot of people conflate the injection drug use epidemic with homelessness, and it's not always the same. We have a pretty small percentage of the opioid users, a pretty small percentage of the injection drug users are actually homeless. There are plenty of people who have a place to sleep, and if they are shooting up, they are going to do it in a place that's safer, where other people can see them or where their dealers are. So, and we're bringing hot teams into the BART stations now. We're working with BART Police and MTA to try to figure out some of the people who really do need help, who are really visible, and who people are really concerned about. So, I mean, that homelessness has changed. So, some of the results. Oh God, this is more of the work that that we've been doing. We added 300 units of permanent supportive housing in the last 12 months. I think that's 370 now with the Auburn opening. We're adding 1,300 more in the next 5 years. We're adding, well, this says 150. I think we're actually up to 500 temporary units now. In 2018, we're planning to add. We're expanding resource center capacity and adding access point services to the resource centers. We launched the Moving On initiative. We added 600 new rapid rehousing subsidies. We launched the One System, that's our single database, and we implemented coordinated entry for families. We are implementing our first instance with adults with our contracted team for coordinated entry in January. So,
I have another question.
Sure.
The navigation centers, I'm only familiar with the one right here on 16th and Mission. Where are the other ones located? And also a follow-up question after.
Sure. So Civic Center Hotel is the one that Rosemary Bosque was discussing. That's an SRO building being used as a navigation center until the permanent construction starts. And that's similar to 1950 Mission. That will eventually be an affordable and supportive housing site. And then we have the Central Waterfront, which is in the Dogpatch neighborhood. And we have 1515 South Van Ness right now, which is a temporary navigation center, and it is slated to close in a few months. So as we bring on 500 more, we lose 115.
Okay. My follow-up question is just about, you said that there would be more to come.
Yes.
And where exactly in the plan or in the pipeline are we at for those that are coming?
Yeah, so we're working with Public Works and Department of Real Estate to nail that down. Mayor Lee was trying to bring on these additional 500 beds. He wanted 1,000 by the end of March. That's hard to get to. We're trying to get to 1,000 this year, in the next year. Most of the temporary navigation center beds would be up in the first 3 months of 2018. So there's a lot coming on.
Jordan Davis, for the record, I heard one of the navigation centers is hopefully going to be women only, and that's something that could help, like, deal with the gender imbalance in supportive housing. And I know Supervisor Kim has been pushing for that.
No, there's amazing political support for navigation centers in general, and Supervisor Kim is absolutely trying to lead the way to have some like women responsive, shelter or nav center beds. And what we're looking at is, and it's an interesting problem actually. We have one that's not a navigation center, that's transitional, that would be opening for pregnant women. And then we're looking at one of our navigation center sites that would have a dorm that's just for women, and like bathroom area that's just for women. But most of the women that we work with in encampments, they're often partnered, and so we have to figure out kind of flexible use for the properties, so that if we make a dorm for 80 women in a navigation center, then are the walls movable? So if we have 100, can we move it out to 100? If we only have 60, can we move it down to 60? And we do this in all the shelter system and navigation center system already, so that we don't have empty beds. It feels like a crime if a shelter has empty beds when we have people on the shelter waiting list. So we have this complex system where we release beds every night if people have a reservation and they're not showing up, so that we can house people who are outside who need a place to sleep. So some of the results, we've had a 13% reduction in youth homelessness since the last point in time count. We had a 12% reduction in family homelessness. So the built pipeline for adult supportive housing was empty. We had a lot of family supportive housing units coming on in the last few years, and it's making an impact. And we had a 30% reduction in chronic homelessness among veterans, which was a priority population. We put a lot of veterans at the top of the list and dedicated a lot of units for veterans. And we can see what the impact is when we do something like that. So these are our principles: courage, common sense, and compassion. And that's the framework. Our next steps are we're rolling out our implementation plan in the next quarter. We're hard at work on putting timelines on all of the goals that we are presenting here and further informing the data. And we're really grateful for our community.
Carrie, thank you so much. I know that the housing inspectors are seeing the benefits of the navigation centers, because we're not seeing the groups or enclaves of individuals on the streets that we've traditionally seen because of the innovative way the navigation centers are set up. So keep up the great work on that.
Thank you.
That's fantastic. And thank you. Were there any other questions or comments from the membership?
Larry Kessler, Public Health. I'm just wondering, does the city actually own any of these supportive housing buildings, or is everything just private ownership and just master lease program and other methods along those lines?
So what the city usually does, so the city has some leases, but so if we want to build a site, we just got a federal land grant for 1068 Mission, and so now the city owns the property and we want to build housing on it. We want to build homeless housing on it. So what we do is we put out a request for qualifications, and then a nonprofit provider can come in and say, we'll come in with this combination of tax credit financing and city financing to build housing there. And so the nonprofit becomes the owner of the site, but they have a 55-year affordability agreement, and the city loans them the money in that agreement so that they have to keep the units dedicated for homeless, very low-income people for 55 years.
Is that similar to what the Housing Authority did recently?
Yes. Yeah, it was kind of a way of the Housing Authority refinancing their portfolio. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I just had one more question, because you say the budget for HSH is 239, 240, plus another 50 I heard from philanthropic, rounded to 300 to be generous. That's like $40,000 annually per person that is homeless.
Right.
What's the biggest hurdle to get somebody housed for $40K a year?
Except when you go back and look at that pie chart, the vast majority of that is actually people who are housed. So our entire population on one night is actually 15,000 people, and our entire population over the course of a year would be about 25,000 people when you consider the ongoing support for people in housing and people who are homeless right now.
Okay, I guess I don't understand your chart, because I thought that was very clear that there were 7,500 homeless, even by San Francisco definition, and that's not accurate.
Right, but we also have 7,400 units of supportive housing. So our department is both.
In addition to the 7,500?
Yes.
So
Yeah, otherwise we wouldn't have any homeless
So
people.
it's
That'd be awesome. Yeah, no, I mean, we have a 1-for-1 ratio actually of supportive housing units to homeless people, but people don't move out typically. I mean, people stay years and years and years, and many people need ongoing support. So we actually only see about 800 of those units open up every year.
Thank you.
I actually, Jordan Davis for record, I had two more brief questions, and the first question is concerning, I know you're a new department, but is there plans to have a oversight commission, much like BIC for DBI and Health Commission for Department of Public Health? And the second question deals with kind of narrow issue, but representative payee requirements, too many people are being required to have representative
Oh, the
payee.
third-party rent.
The third-party rent, and I'm wondering, what are you doing about, having, an oversight committee for, DHSH?
We just call it HSH.
HSH as a whole, and also, what are you doing to, make sure that people who can manage their own affairs can pay the rent by personal check?
Mm-hmm. So, to the first question, we have the local homeless coordinating board, and we bring our policies, reports to them, similarly to have people bring to a commission, and we also have a public comment period and a report from the department every month at the local board, and those announcements are on our website. It's typically the first Monday of the month. As far as landlord or provider policies on third-party rent payment, so what we've found is that in supportive housing, the instance of non-payment eviction is less than 2%, whereas people who've been homeless who move into housing without third-party rent payment, it's much, much higher. So when I looked at it, and it's been a number of years, but it was closer to 30%. And so it obviously makes a huge difference in terms of just stabilizing finances and making sure that the rent comes first. There are obviously people who have stabilized in subsidized housing who may no longer need that. And it's a question of individual provider policy. It's a move-in policy for us. So we make sure that as people come in, they're getting the financial stabilization. So
I feel but I'm just going to say that I feel it's very infantilizing. I'm sure people may need that, but a lot of people like myself have paid rent for years, on the on different places, and then to be forced into this is kind of really treating me like a child. So
it's an experience that's not uncommon for those that have managed finances. It does, however, do away with the negative background check on unpaid rent or eviction of because of non-payment of rent. Those fall away if you signed up for third-party rent payment, and it's not representative payee. It's non-payment of rent. So we don't force anybody to be or become a representative payee member.
Right. So it's literally like a direct deposit, direct withdrawal type situation that our department endorses, where as long as the rent part of the check goes to the third party rent payment agency, then we don't require or enforce anything beyond that.
Any other membership questions?
I have 2 questions. This is Diana Martinez for the record. First of all, thank you for giving this presentation. It was really informative. I'm wondering if we could have a copy of the PowerPoint emailed to us.
I'm not sure.
I was going to ask
Yeah.
that when
Oh,
everybody
okay,
was
great.
finished. Go ahead.
Those statistics are really,
Okay.
really interesting.
And and to be clear, like the entire framework is on our website, which has way more information than the PowerPoint. And there's also an executive summary that includes almost everything that's in the PowerPoint. So I can check on that because
Karen, one of the
it's
things
Jeff's
we're
admin.
obligated
has
to
that.
do is to take the PowerPoint and put it on our website for the membership and anybody that will be listening to the audio. And then what we can do is then include on our website, so that Jennifer and I will work on this, is a link to your website for purposes of today's discussion.
Sure, that's great. And if I can't get the PowerPoint to you, then I would say the executive summary is really a great tool. Thank you.
Thank you. And my second question is about your data research.
Sure.
I was wondering if during your research you have done a lot of research on the effects of gentrification that would take place in the next 5 to 10 years. I know that you've got really great goals, and it looks very, very exciting. I wonder if the effects of gentrification would increase homelessness more than we're expecting, though, and so I'm wondering if you all have taken that research into account as well.
Yeah, that is not built into our data model yet. And it's tricky to calculate because we have the supportive housing, the shelters, and the homeless population, and planning has the permits for new building, and Mayor's Office of Housing has the pipeline for building new affordable and supportive. I know that the Mayor's Office of Housing is working on something like that. I'm not sure it is as specific to gentrification, but it does inform the regional housing needs analysis that the nonprofit housing corporation puts together every year, which is a regional group.
Any other questions or comments? Carrie, thank you
Great,
so
thank
much.
you.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thank
all.
you.
These are really amazing questions.
Thank you for that.
And thank you, Wolfgang, for representing us here.
Thank you. Okay, so was there any public comment on that item? And that was the presentation for the Department of Homelessness and Supportive Housing, item number 4. There being none, we'll then move on to agenda item number 5, administrative announcements. I just have one, and maybe some other members may have more information on this. I don't have it currently in front of me, but there has been the introduction at the Board of Supervisors at one of the subcommittees, land use, a couple weeks ago, legislation that talks about gender-neutral signage for common bathrooms in residential hotels. What we will do is forward to everyone the file number of that. It has not been scheduled before the board because since it's proposing to amend the San Francisco Housing Code, it has to go through a hearing before the Building Inspection Commission and the Code Advisory Committee of the Department of Building Inspection before it goes forward. So what I will do is get that information and forward that to all of you so that you've got that information. Obviously, there's not an ordinance number yet, just a Board of Supervisors file number. So I don't have any other administrative announcements. Does anyone else have anything? Sure.
I just for the record, the file number is 171285. It was introduced by Supervisor Ronan with Supervisors Kim, Peskin, and Sheehy co-sponsoring, and it also was referred to the Youth Commission, and the Youth Commission unanimously voted to support this, and some members of the Youth Commission have approached me and said that they're interested in a lot of SRO issues, so there might be some ways we could work together, like going forward on this and other things.
Thank you. Any other administrator? And like I said, well, for those that didn't write that down, we'll go ahead and forward that to you in an email so that you've got it for reference, and we'll try and scan the legislation to get that out to you as well. Any other administrative announcements? There being none, is there any public comment on agenda item number 5? Then let's move then to agenda item number 6, reports from SRO collaboratives. Are there any reports today or any updates that any of the collaboratives would like to share?
Yes, Diana Martinez for the
Thank
record.
you, Diana.
The Mission SRO Collaborative will be hiring a new outreach coordinator, and his start date will be January 8th. So at that point, at least the Dolores Street side of the collaborative will be fully staffed again, which is very exciting. Right now our partners, the Women's Community Clinic, does have 2 openings. They've got their outreach coordinator position open, and they have that person's supervisor, the director, is also, that position is also open.
Very good, thank you.
Raul Fernandez Oriozábal with the SRO Families United Collaborative. Quick update. On December 8th, the collaborative held its annual retreat. So we started our 5-year plan, and it was very exciting. We had really good conversations among the group. Also, we're very excited preparing for the early stage of implementation of the housing vouchers with the Housing Authority. We foresee this happening by the end of January, like the first people start being receiving those vouchers, and we'll start helping them seeking for housing. We're also setting up dates with the Department of Public Health and DBI for trainings for our peer organizers, particularly with the focus of code enforcement. And last, Coalition on Homelessness is hiring for a peer organizer position, also part of the SRO Families United Collaborative.
Thank you. Any other reports? Any other discussion on this particular agenda item? There being none, is there any public comment on agenda item number 6, reports from SRO collaboratives? There being none, then let's move to agenda item number 7, prioritization of future meeting topics. Is it the desire of the membership to go ahead and put the proposed legislation regarding the amendments to the housing code on the agenda for the January meeting? Because I'd be more than happy to do that. By then, you'll all have a copy, and I'll probably know that the process is that once it's introduced, the clerk of the board then sends it to the Department of Building Inspection to be scheduled before the Building Inspection Commission and reviewed by the department's Code Advisory Committee. So I'll know a little more information as to when those may be scheduled, and I'll be able to forward that information to you as well. I don't believe we have any guest speakers for January, but that would be definitely an item to add to the agenda. What else would you like for the January meeting?
I know that I know I've been calling for this for several months now, and I also emailed you and Osea about this, but I'm hoping to have like a discussion on like immigrant issues and SROs, and just like and I guess when you said housing code amendments, you meant the gender neutral bathrooms thing, and I would be open to that too, and we voted to support that like in June, so just an FYI there. Was the first item immigration, did you say? I'm sorry. Immigration issues and SROs. Okay, and you have mentioned that, and we, as we all know, the membership has asked to have these other, and I believe you as well, we have these different guest speakers, so we definitely will try then for early in the year to see if we can get somebody from that group to come and speak. We will deal with their schedule, so it's not like we're ignoring that particular request, but there's been an assortment of requests, so we'll definitely see if we can get a speaker to talk about that issue. If we can't, though, for January, I mean, we'll definitely try and do that January, February, March, depending upon the availability. What else would you like to see on the agenda for January? Any other items?
Dan Jordan, for the record. I'd like to bring up the issue about the bed bugs.
Bed bugs, yes, we do have that. And the
Okay.
question there was, Larry, is it possible for you or DPH to give a presentation on the code enforcement process and the criteria about bed bugs in January or February?
Yeah, we could do it, Larry Kessler, Public Health. I would prefer February, only
Okay.
because in the beginning of February, our group is going to an all-day training on bed bug issues in hotels.
So how's that? We would do
So,
February, because he would get the
February.
benefit of that, if there was any new innovative things. So we would target to put that on for the February meeting. And then if we get a guest speaker as well, we could definitely work with the agenda on that. Okay, so that looks like January, February, and then at the subsequent meetings, we can discuss anything else you would like to put on the agenda. Any other suggestions? These are all great. Okay, there being none, is there any public comment regarding agenda item number 7, prioritization of future meeting topics?
Jump in.
Was there some more discussion?
Sorry, Clifford Gilmore. One I wanted to just mention for the record, maybe a future subject for a future meeting next year topic, and that is, as it pertains to supportive housing, not necessarily service animals, but companion animals, in the sense that it's all about compliance, because I think companion animals are not required to be trained such as service animals are. Now, some of this falls under fair housing laws and whatnot. And I think particularly this has been ongoing in many of THC's supportive housing sites, and there's site policies in terms of compliance and whatnot. But there's certainly some animals, and some, particularly dogs, in some counties that have been banned. And there are pit bulls actually in some supportive housing, and there's been some behavioral issues with that. So I think it bears having a conversation about something.
And Clifford, what are we, so is it something where you would like us to look at the various policies from the different master lease providers, or what would you suggest as far as, I mean, is it something that we need HSA, DPH, HSH? I know, well, thanks, Wolfgang. Do you have anything to, what would you suggest?
Because it's so convoluted, right?
Yes, okay.
And I just had
Interesting.
a discussion with the mayor's office on disability around this. Animal care and control would be a good one. But in all of these instances, an animal, regardless of companion or service animal, always has to be under the control of the owner.
Right, sometimes they're not.
Sometimes they're not, then they can
I
call
want to
animal
talk with
care
them
and
further
control.
about it. So is this our, so there's a distinction between a companion and a service dog, service animal. And our local, the city agency that addresses that is what agency sets those policies? Is it animal control? Yeah, okay. And then there's the various policies within the providers, and that's a very good question. Okay, so we may have to do a little research, but we'll go ahead and look at that maybe in March or so. And we also have the bylaws coming, so that's going to be February, March. Okay, but that's a very good question. They're looking at you. Peter.
It also extends beyond just dogs. We've seen comfort rodents. We've seen many different things that end up causing problems in these hotels.
Very important point, Larry. Thank you. Any other discussion on this item? Any public comment? So with that, is there any, moving on to agenda item number 8, general public comment. Is there any general public comment on something that was not previously discussed or agendized today? There being none, we are in adjournment at 10:25. Our next meeting will be here in this room on Thursday, January 18th at 9 a.m. Thank you all for coming. And happy holidays to everyone.
Thank you.